In December 1978, officially responding to cross-border attacks, the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and captured Phnom Penh.
Hanoi launches Operation Blooming Lotus, a full-scale invasion of Cambodia from the east. More than 150,000 Vietnamese troops storm across the border under massive air support. Less than 2 weeks later, Phnom Penh falls.
To preempt this imagined attack, he sent Khmer Rouge troops into Vietnam, where they slaughtered hundreds of villagers. This action provoked Hanoi into launching a full-scale invasion in December 1978. And within days, Vietnamese troops had taken the capital. Pol Pot had no choice but to flee. Thanks to his own arrogance, he'd paved the way for his arch-enemies to take over his nation.
If he had given the Vietnamese no reason to want to attack him.
Pol Pot himself had escaped and again sought refuge in the jungle. Despite his flawed leadership, the Khmer Rouge remained loyal.
After 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, the Pol Pot regime is finished.
Having consolidated their hold on Cambodia, the Vietnamese installed their allied government in Phnom Penh. Heng Samrin was appointed Prime Minister.
The government army was supported by more than 140,000 Vietnamese troops. More than 1 million Vietnamese were invited to settle in Cambodia.
To escape the fighting, seeking food and shelter, Cambodian refugees to Thailand, where an emergency operation was hastily set up to provide for their basic needs. While the world saw the full horror of the situation on the Thai-Cambodian border and learnt of the terrible suffering of the Cambodian people under the 4-year Khmer Rouge regime. Refugee camps were established in Thailand for the thousands of Cambodians arriving daily. From these camps, over 200,000 Cambodians were resettled in third countries. For a while, Thailand allowed these refugees onto its soil, but in 1980, fearing future security problems, it closed its border. New arrivals had to settle in makeshift camps on the Cambodian side of the border, where the 3 factions who had each in turn ruled Cambodia, the Sihanoukists, Republicans and Khmer Rouge, organized their own camps from which they recruited their separate resistance forces. In 1982, these 3 factions joined together to form the coalition government of Cambodia recognized by the United Nations. From these military-oriented camps, the Cambodian resistance launched their attacks against Vietnamese positions. But in 1984, the Vietnamese hit back, forcing the resistance to flee into Thailand. Women, children and civilian men were shifted to evacuation sites constructed on Thai soil, not as refugees, but as displaced people without status or protection under international law. They must remain in these camps until such time as they could return safely to the border area. Site B was the evacuation site for those loyal to Prince Sihanouk. Site 8 was living in camps under Khmer Rouge control, and Site 2 for the Republicans. While the soldiers of the Cambodian resistance, the majority of the men, regrouped along a several-kilometer-wide no-man's land between Cambodia and Thailand, a minefield now known as the Hidden Border. From the so-called hidden border between Thailand and Cambodia, the Red Cross bring another war casualty to their field hospital in the Khao I Dang refugee camp. Since 1979, some 15,000 wounded soldiers have been treated here, and as a result of mines, the most common cause of injury, more than 2,000 legs amputated. These young soldiers were wounded fighting for the Cambodian resistance. Since 1979, when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and set up their allied administration, the Cambodian resistance have been fighting to regain control of their homeland. The United Nations handles the day-to-day logistics of transporting 3 million litres of water daily to these camps and of distributing 900 tons of foodstuffs a week. In Site B live some 50,000 followers of Prince Sihanouk, while the Khmer Rouge-controlled Site 8 accounts for some 35,000 Cambodians. But by far the biggest is Site 2, the camp of the Khmer People's National Liberation Front. Situated less than 2 kilometers from the border, Site 2 has a present population of over 170,000. In these temporary evacuation sites live more than 250,000 Cambodians. Well over half of this population is under 15 years of age. Children who only know camp life and queuing for rations.
When I lived in Cambodia, I had 5 acres of land. I had rice fields and an orchard. We worked according to the different seasons. Otherwise, we could play and laugh as we wished. We could go anywhere we wanted, because it was our land. It was our country. But here we have nothing. We depend totally upon others. If they breathe, we can breathe with them. But if they stop breathing, we will die immediately. In 1979, my daughter's husband left home to become a soldier. 6 months later, we came to the border to join him at Kokrum camp. When the Vietnamese attacked Kokrum camp, we ran to another camp. When they attacked this camp, we ran to Retison camp. After they attacked Retison camp, we went to Bang Phu camp. Later, we were moved from Bang Phu here to Site 2. Living conditions are better here than in the previous camp. But we are so close to the Vietnamese, we can even hear the ringing of their lunch bell. We are more worried at night than during the day. If we are attacked in the daytime, it is easier for us to gather all the children and flee. But if during the nighttime we are attacked, in the panic we might not recognize our children from the other children, and we can easily become separated from each other.
ta miền lưu xô phơi xô ấy chẳng tới kia mình vô mau nó trâu khoa hay nó mình đang ruột tới tròn na tới cả hộp kia ruột nơi nó kia cùm rong ta khuôn kia đái mình đôi dương thưa sai khuôn dương tới dương phi ấy mà ó chân rục dương cao máu canh tới đó thấy nín rồi cái thà thưa sai lừa làm nhá vừa thà về mình làm mình mau thế sao có sọ nữa mình miên ấy thế
In Cambodia, everything had its season. During the rice growing season, we farmed the rice. Then there was the season to look for fish, another to collect firewood. But here there are no seasons. We no longer know what we did in this season or that season. We just wait to receive the aid, and everyone is now becoming ignorant. As for the children, they know nothing about the work as they have never done any. But if we return to Cambodia, they will learn all of this work. How to farm rice, how to plow. Now they only know how to receive assistance. We are not happy to receive assistance. We have arms and legs. We know how to earn our living. In Cambodia, if we were sick or we missed 2 or 3 days, our rice would still be in the fields. But here, if it is the day of the distribution, if we don't go, we will get nothing. So we have to go, even if we are sick, otherwise we will have nothing. When we have plenty, it is very easy for us to give to others, but it is very difficult always receiving. We go to get water whenever they call for a distribution. The number of rations depends on the size of the family. A family with a lot of rations will receive a lot of water. But if you have 1 ration, you receive 1 bucket of water. Sometimes, if they hear the sound of shelling, only 2 or 3 shells, the trucks will not come, and for the whole day we have nothing. If the truck comes, we have no problems. But if the truck does not come, we will have no water. When we were in Cambodia, if we wanted to go to the river or the lake, at any time we could go.
អើយបងព្រាត់ពីអូនទៅដោយមានគេបំបែកឲ្យគ្នាពីគ្នាតែគួរឲ្យស្ដាយណាស់ពីព្រោះយើងសាងសុភមង្គលមិនបានយូរផងសប្តាហ៍ថ្ងៃបងសែននឹកមកដល់រូបអូននិងកូនសំឡាញ់ទាំងអស់ព្រមទាំងអ្នកម្ដាយមានតែទឹកភ្នែកទេសប្តាហ៍ថ្ងៃដែលជួយរំលែកទុក្ខរបស់ខ្ញុំមានតែទឹកភ្នែកទេសប្តាហ៍ថ្ងៃដែលជួយរំលែកទុក្ខរបស់ខ្ញុំមិនគួរណារូបខ្ញុំខ្លាយជាជនពិការសោះអ្នកម្ដាយសូមអ្នកម្ដាយអភ័យទោសឲ្យរូបកូនផងដែលកូនធ្វើអ្វីខុសទាំងប៉ុន្មានចំណែកចន្ទថាសូមអូនអភ័យទោសឲ្យរូបបងផងណាដែលបងធ្វើខុសទាំងប៉ុន្មានទៅលើរូបអូនតែអូនអាណិតដល់រូបបងផងពីព្រោះមានអនុស្សាវរីយ៍នឹងគ្នាច្រើនណាស់នៅក្នុងព្រៃតែពីរនាក់ដែលវេទនារោគអ្វីប្រៀបផ្ទឹមពុំបានឡើយបងនឹកឃើញអស់ហើយអនុស្សាវរីយ៍ទាំងប៉ុន្មានតែបងស្ដាយជើងរបស់បងទាំងពីរណាស់កាត់ជើងកាត់ប្រវែងតែជើងក៏ត្រូវតែកាត់ពីការទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងមិនស្លាប់មែនតែទៅកូនខ្ញុំគ្មានណាគាត់ទេគុំគ្រួសារខ្ញុំវាត្រូវធ្លាក់មិនស្លាប់ពីដើមបានកូនមានជំងឺតែទៅរួញចាំនៅសង្គមគ្រួសារតែឥឡូវនេះកូនវាជើងពីការប៉ុណ្ណឹងឈាមទាំងដីអូនអើយបងវីពួនស្ទាំតែមានតាមផ្លូវជាតិយើងនៅរស់ក៏ក្រឹងក្រក្រែងមានតារូបបងដែលអ្នកNow Yi no longer has her proper senses, and whenever she thinks of her husband, she can do nothing. Sometimes she doesn't hear when her child cries. She just sits there in a daze. Bạn hơi tình nâng nung cái prap thà từ mục nung có mò phùm nung về trâu min đạch chương đạch ấy từng o hơi hay nhom của bạn chết na lơ cái đất vô từ pe khảo đàng để nhom từ tu tình nâng thì kê nung có mình ban từ khơi to này thế nhom của chọn từ na đây bên tay kê mình ao từ lo hơi nhom của bạn chết na từ ngày nung từ cung cua xa nhom nung về về tình niên khơi cát lang nơi trong chân rôm ní cát lang khơi qua ta rót ta nâng crab miền khơi sập bài thế miền ta crab nâng anh thắt nia về tình mình để nơi trong chân rôm ní miền ca sập bài ấy sao không đăng đây lang khơi ta crab nâng anh I try to grow some vegetables to help support my family, but they all die as there is not enough water.
If he stays here, he can do nothing. If we could return to Cambodia, he could look after the house and the children. His wife could work in the rice field to support the family. But here, he can do nothing. And if we are attacked, not only do we have to gather all the children and flee, but we will also have to push the wheelchair of a handicap. For all the distributions, it is the same. We are given according to the number of rations in the family. It is the same for firewood. If a family has one ration, they receive a small piece of wood, like the calf of a leg. And nobody seems to care if this is enough for the week or not. If a family has a lot of rations, they will get a bigger piece of wood. But they also have a bigger cooking pot.
Dasmada, ban, comprendai, ban lo. Pichung, chim, from here, ban, pichung, ban. Chung pi, pon man, chung pi, ban. Ai pran ban. Tinitir, ban lo, Allez, tiens, balo. Ban, nein, nicht hein, allez, tao, ouais. As for Mon, here she cannot take her studies as far as she needs to. Her teacher hasn't got enough books to give the children. He teaches all he knows, but he doesn't know very much. He can only explain a little.
and it doesn't go very deep as he is not an educated man. At most, they can study to the primary level. She will learn to read and write her name, but not much more. In Cambodia, we had many different kinds of fish. But here, if they give us canned fish, we eat canned fish. If they give us dried fish, we eat dried fish. And if they give us nothing extra, we just eat salt with the rice. The children at present have heard about returning to Cambodia, but they don't know what Cambodia looks like. We want very much to get out. If we could fly, we would fly over this fence. But we cannot fly. We can only look out, but not leave.
Just 46 kilometers from Site 2 is Khao I Dang, the last Cambodian refugee camp in Thailand with the remaining refugees who arrived before 1980. Unlike the displaced people, the refugees here have the possibility, if selected after interviews, to begin new lives in a third country.
I want to tell you that you are expected to go to Australia. You've been accepted.
Right, well, can you tell me the reasons that you left Cambodia?
Once selected for resettlement, the refugees leave Kaui Dang for the transit camp at Panat Nikom, near Bangkok. After medical clearance, they'll spend between 6 weeks and 6 months here studying language and cultural orientation. The United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and France accept the most Cambodians for resettlement.
De la neige. De la neige. Alice et Isabelle sont dans le jardin.
Michel est caché derrière l'arbre.
Michel est caché derrière l'arbre.
Reunification is now the most important criterion for selection. But because of the enormous difficulties in tracing family members, this may take years to happen, if it happens at all. This family had been separated for 12 years.
And people that don't know of our situation might say that we have no worries living here, that everything is provided for us. Rice is given to us, clothes are given to us, water is brought to us. They bring all these things for us. But I can assure them that it is far from easy living in this camp.
cho bữa ngày nào cái mình khai mình thiệt mình phao đấy cái vô mau cho bữa kia mình đưa xôn trên chống kia mình vô mau dương nâng trâu ọt đấy bữa sinh giờ đôi chờ dương nâu sọc mai sâu dương thưa khuôn dương nó phải lai phải lọc ấy dương đâm dương đâu ấy khuôn dương ban đôi chờ tray sạch ấy dương rùa ban dương miền khi miền pruy ấy anh tôi tiêu tôi xin riêng bên trong xe ơi tray trong trong xe miền con trai ấy đang nói miền mai âu bông ôn của miền đó small má xin riêng của bạn ô này xin riêng đấy không mà hôm mà hả má nó sắp anh tôi tiêu tôi xin riêng bên trong xe ơi tray trong trong má ơi sao ạ sao đây má mưa raอยู่สังหาโนก็เกียรติខ្មែរដោយទម្គង់វងនៅល្អរឹងប៉ឹងជុំយើងសង្ឃឹមពរភពព្រេងសំណាររបស់កម្ពុជា
Nothing in my career as a journalist prepared me for the horrors I found in Cambodia. Like those who came upon Auschwitz and Belsen, the experience and the shock are difficult to describe. And yet 10 years later, I find myself shocked again and seriously doubting if the enormity of what happened here is understood outside. How can it be understood when those responsible are not only allowed to go free and unpunished, but are living comfortably with expense accounts? The head of the extermination centre at Tuol Sleng was Comrade Dutch. His chief torturer was Comrade Pon. All around me are the graves of their victims. Today, both these men are guests of the government of Thailand, where they are protected and sustained with the United Nations aid. Among the tourists and massage parlours of Thailand, Pol Pot and killers like Comrade Dutch lead a good life. Pol Pot himself lives here in a Thai military camp known as V4 near the town of Trat. Thai troops escort him to his luxurious beach house at Bang Sien, a tourist resort, and to this modern hospital in Bangkok, where the man who brought genocide and starvation to his people is treated for irritating hemorrhoids. Few geopolitical games have been as cynical and bereft of all moral consideration as that which has isolated and punished the people of Cambodia. In 1979, President Carter's National Security Advisor, Dr. Brzezinski, implemented a policy known as playing the China card. The aim was to cultivate China and to further divide Peking and Moscow. But China's oldest enemy is Vietnam, which occupies a strategic bridge to the rest of Asia. Since 1975, Peking had backed Pol Pot as a means of destabilizing neighboring Vietnam. And Chinese support for Pol Pot continued after the Vietnamese drove the Khmer Rouge into Thailand. Moreover, the United States backed China and led an economic boycott of Vietnam and Cambodia. In Washington, there was, and still is, great bitterness that Vietnam had defeated and humiliated the United States. Revenge became the policy. Off the record, officials spoke about bleeding Vietnam white on the battlefield of Cambodia. The Thai border camps became a media circus. In 1980, State Department sources revealed plans for an international propaganda campaign aimed at spreading atrocity stories about Vietnamese behavior in Cambodia. This drew attention away from the Khmer Rouge, which the United States was then secretly backing. Dr. Brzezinski himself briefed leading journalists, such as James Reston of the New York Times and the BBC's Alastair Cook. They were shown a CIA report which accused the Vietnamese of refusing to relieve the suffering of the Cambodian people. No journalist questioned the authenticity of the report, and Reston wrote an impassioned article which was syndicated widely. The briefing journalists received was based entirely on false information. Genocide was now associated not only with Pol Pot, but with those who had ended the slaughter. Prime Minister Thatcher supported American and Chinese policy and visited the Cambodian refugee camps just over the border in Thailand, where British SAS troops trained Cambodian guerrillas allied with the Khmer Rouge. Mrs. Thatcher did not see any of the camps where the United Nations Border Relief Operation allows the Khmer Rouge to hold 45,000 people hostage.
Everyone having suffered under Pol Pot, and you know, we saw some of the terrible pictures and accounts of the atrocities at home, and I think we were all perturbed that we couldn't do something about it, and the United Nations couldn't do anything about it.
With help from Thailand, he established a new base here along the Thai-Cambodian border. With 100,000 troops under his command, he plotted his comeback. Throughout the 1980s, his troops attacked civilian trains, took hostages, and indiscriminately planted landmines throughout the countryside. While Pol Pot lurked in the shadows, he reverted to his old tactics. He put forward his affable deputy, Khieu Samphan, as the respectable public face of the Khmer Rouge. And once again, he joined forces with his oldest rival, Prince Sihanouk. Although Sihanouk now despised the Khmer Rouge, he saw them as a necessary evil in the war against the Vietnamese. The West agreed. At the height of the Cold War, Pol Pot was a useful buffer against Vietnam. America's tacit support helped to sustain the Khmer Rouge.
There was no mention of the fact that the United States, through the United Nations, was sustaining the Khmer Rouge in camps along the border with Thailand. In 1980, we filmed this food convoy going to a Khmer Rouge camp. It is paid for by Western governments. The commander of the camp was called Nam Phan and was known to aid workers as the Butcher and Pol Pot's Himmler. The United States government wrote two American relief workers, Linda Mason and Roger Brown, insisted that the Khmer Rouge be fed. The United States preferred that the Khmer Rouge operation benefit from the credibility of an internationally known relief operation. The meaning of all this was clear, but it seldom made news. A revitalized Khmer Rouge was to continue America's war against Vietnam by other means, and a general Vietnamese suffering and struggle was to be discredited.
The Khmer Rouge are touted to have the most troops, well-trained and supplied with about 500 tons of arms a month from China. Their main target is the government army. No one really knows how large or well-equipped it is, particularly in light of the recent withdrawal of Vietnamese troops. Two non-communist groups fight both the government and the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer People's National Liberation Front, known as the KPLNF, and the Armée Nationale de Sihanouk. The rainy seasons belong to the three guerrilla forces infiltrating from Thailand. The dry months to the government's army that pushes them back. But there are reports in all groups of splits between hardline and moderate factions. For about $25 and a new uniform, these two young men will leave the government forces and join the non-communists.
In the government army, there was not enough food and no freedom. When you want to work, you have to ask the commander for permission. And we were taken away from our homes and our families.
Every village has a group of men forced by the government to serve in its militia, often badly trained and armed. Since most Cambodians hated the Vietnamese, their allegiance to Hun Sen is questionable. The loyalty of most Cambodian villagers depends on which army is visiting. The KPLNF is paying a friendly visit to this village in northwest Cambodia, where guerrilla activity is the heaviest. The deputy chief of this village told us,
The Vietnamese exploited all of the people. They took the auction carts to help them to carry ammunition to their location and forced people to be servants for them. They have threatened robbery and rape to the people of this village.
the regiment exchanges money and medicine for food and information. Cambodia had regularly supplied its population with more rice per person than any other Southeast Asian nation, even when crops were poor. When the Vietnamese took over in 1979, the decade of war had devastated rice production, and more than 2 million people were threatened with starvation. Cambodia got little Western aid in 1979 because it would not guarantee the supplies would go only to the civilian population, not the government and military. Those remaining in Cambodia were nearly as badly off as those who had fled to refugee camps just over the border in Thailand. Aid to the refugee camps was also inadequate, and Thailand, already concerned about its security, resented carrying the burden at the expense of its own population. A westernized capitalist country, Thailand was less than sympathetic to the plight of the refugees. It feared the next wave would be Vietnamese soldiers intent on taking over and installing a communist regime. In order to create a buffer between itself and Vietnam, Thailand allowed many of the refugee camps to become military bases for the resistance forces. It also allowed Chinese military supplies through to the most powerful force, the Khmer Rouge. In turn, China agreed to curtail support for the Thai Communist Party, an ongoing internal security threat. Thailand encouraged the non-communist resistance groups to join the Khmer Rouge and even forced civilians to help them. In April 1979, Thai military allowed Khmer Rouge soldiers to use more than 50,000 Cambodian civilians as human minesweepers. A few months later, Thailand forced the repatriation of 45,000 more refugees. They were driven to the ancient temple of Pre We Hear. Their Thai money was taken, and they were given a cup of rice each and forced down a mountain path flanked by landmines. These soldiers are victims of landmines who made it to a hospital in time to be saved. Those at Pre We Hear who did not step on landmines often perished from hunger and thirst or were killed by the Vietnamese. Only about 2,000 people were rescued. One survivor recalls,
"The crowd was very dense. It was impossible to number the victims of the landmines. The wounded people were moaning. The most difficult part of the walk was near the dead bodies. Tears I thought had dried up long ago came back to my eyes, less because of the sight than from the thought that those innocent people had paid with their lives for their attempts to reach freedom in a world that was too selfish."
Victims of landmines are still a common sight all through Cambodia. This farmer who lives in a northwestern province stepped on a landmine and has gangrene. He will probably die because his leg will not be amputated in time.
This would must only to amputation cut off.
But all the hardship has not killed the Cambodian spirit. This sign in front of a refugee camp sums up the Cambodians' hopes. Please help us go back home. Please help us turn Vietnamese killing fields into Cambodian farming fields. But this has not been easy, as 8 of 10 rice crops failed following the Vietnamese takeover. While Western and Soviet bloc aid and private vegetable gardens nearly banished the specter of famine, thousands of children were still malnourished. Even though Vietnam denies it, much of the rice harvest has been diverted to Vietnam, which is in desperate financial straits. Vietnam decided to withdraw from Cambodia because it badly needs Western aid and development projects. When it invaded Cambodia, Japan and the European Economic Community cut off aid. The United States moved to limit loans from the International Monetary Fund and curtail United Nations projects. More than $10 billion US is needed to rebuild the country's infrastructure. With inflation at 800% a year, the population growing by 1 million a year, and close to 1 million people in danger of dying of starvation, Vietnam could not afford to continue its occupation. By 1989, Vietnam's per capita income had fallen so low that it was one of the poorest countries in the world. Vietnam is looking for Western forgiveness and development funds to pull it out of the basement of the international community. The spirit of the Vietnamese is in as bad shape as the economy. As one revolutionary leader said, Vietnam won the war, but lost the peace.
For me, as a messenger, I like to say that the Vietnamese invade and liberate Cambodia, and now the Vietnamese are leaving. We, the Cambodian people, want to hear that the world tries to prevent the return of the Khmer Rouge.
These were among the last Vietnamese troops to leave. They have trained a Cambodian army and militia which have none of the combat experience of the Khmer Rouge and none of the arms and supplies provided by China and the West.
The Khmer Rouge threat is enormous, and the tragedy is that we didn't have to come to this, that the United States, and I think our policy through Democratic and Republican administrations, has been to cynically use the Khmer Rouge as a to force the Vietnamese out of Cambodia without any thought to the long range, to what happens after you've killed this monster. How do you control it? And now we come to the moment of truth.
And how many divisions of Khmer Rouge are actually in this area now?
There are 5 divisions.
And each Khmer Rouge division is about 500 or 600 men.
Each division consists of 600 men.
Right, so that's about 3,500 Khmer Rouge troops are actually in this area now. And what are they doing?
They are engaging in individual attacks. They are waiting until after the Vietnamese pull out.
Clearly what he's saying is there's going to be a major attack by the Khmer Rouge.
That's correct.
What form will that attack take?
They will be engaging in full-scale attacks throughout the country in order to try and take over the country.
It's difficult for a foreigner to understand the fear that so many Cambodian people feel about the return of Pol Pot unless you come here to the west, where the black-shirted troops of Pol Pot are part of the shadows that sweep across the fields and paddies after the rains, and where every journey carries great risk. This road near Persat was opened only last year, and you're advised to travel early in the morning when the roads are said to be cleared of mines and reach your destination no later than mid-afternoon, when the Khmer Rouge may reappear or they may not. The uncertainty you feel, the fear, is a glimpse into the heart of this stricken country. We are represented here by something called the Coalition of the Government of Democratic Kampuchea. But this is an illusion. It's not a coalition, it's not a government, it's not democratic, and it's not in Kampuchea. It's a cover behind which Pol Pot and his defunct regime are allowed to represent their victims. Just imagine if West Germany's seat in the United Nations was still occupied by Hitler's Third Reich in exile, and that the swastika flew here in United Nations Plaza in New York. And imagine if this barely credible state of us was largely the result of pressure by the major democracies, such as the United States and Britain. Well, that is exactly what has happened to Cambodia.
Even the European, even American, try to think that that flag is not important, but for the victim, they think that is like the Jews see the Hitler flag flying any place. It doesn't mean have to fly at the United Nations. If the Jews saw that flag flying anywhere, how you feel? You know this is no justice.
There certainly appears to be no justice when this man, Khieu Samphan, architect of Pol Pot's genocidal policy, becomes part of an international charade. In 1982, China and the United States invented the coalition, making Khieu Samphan Foreign Minister, Sihanouk, Cambodia's former ruler, president. The aim was to appease growing international revulsion about the Khmer Rouge. In fact, nothing had changed. Pol Pot had merely stepped back into the shadows. The coalition's ambassador to the United Nations is Pol Pot's man, Thun Prasit. It was this man who was given the job of finding Cambodian intellectuals and students living abroad and persuading them to return home, where they were murdered. Today he occupies luxurious offices on 3rd Avenue in New York. On the face of it, the coalition consists of the Khmer Rouge and two so-called non-communist groups, one group led by Prince Sihanouk and the other by a former Prime Minister, Son Sann. They are the respectable face. But the Khmer Rouge dominates the coalition in every way. Above all, it has been a propaganda success. It has allowed both the Reagan and Bush administrations to distance themselves publicly from Pol Pot, while campaigning for American arms to be sent to the so-called non-communist members of the coalition, knowing that they will end up with the Khmer Rouge. The most important player in this game is Prince Sihanouk, promoted in Washington as the good guy of the coalition. Sihanouk has always been all things to all people.
Sihanouk, once duped by the Khmer Rouge, may be duped again. He has told Prime Minister Hun Sen that Cambodia must include the Khmer Rouge in finding a solution to Cambodia's struggle for peace.
Sihanouk's collaboration continued today. On March the 17th, 1989, he wrote to supporters in the United States, thanking them for sending him, as he put it, a list of treasonous Cambodians whose crime was to visit their homeland. He signed himself President of Democratic Kampuchea, the Khmer Rouge government in exile. According to John Pedler, a former British diplomat who knows him well, Sihanouk remains in awe of the Khmer Rouge. They are like the rabbit and the snake, wrote Pedler. A hardcore Khmer Rouge is often amongst his entourage today, a constant reminder to him that his life is still in their hands.
I do not want a military solution to the problem, but a peaceful a political solution. But in order to get a political solution with Vietnam and the Soviet Union, we must fight first. And to fight is to have the Khmer Rouge also in the coalition, because they are the main fighting force.